My man, I haven't seen him in a while, so I'm glad to be able to talk to him, especially with all the events that are taking place today. Caleb Maupin. Caleb Maupin is a speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, and author. He has, well, you have another book that's out. What is
I've
the
always
name of that?
I've always got different books, but right now, one book I've been really talking a lot about is my book on the Houthis. Who are the Houthis and what are they fighting for? This is the book, and we've been distributing that all across the Chicago area because we're having a conference, an anti-war conference on July 12th.
Yeah.
So we've been distributing thousands of copies of this book at anti-war demonstrations and other things, telling the story of the Houthi movement, what they're all about. This book it's in the process of being translated into some different languages. It's quite a popular text, but I've written a number of books over the years and discussed them with you. Books about Kamala Harris, books about Khrushchevism, books about the regime change industry. So yeah, I hope that's helpful.
I'm glad you started there because I'm super curious on your take on this. Is it possible to take peace short of having a gun to do it? Meaning, I've gotten to the point where I believe that peace is taken at the barrel of a gun. And that is an unfortunate point of view, but that seems to be the case. For example, when the Soviet Union fell, it seems that the West had took the position that, well, Russia is a conquered country, they were a fallen country, so we don't have to pay attention to what they're saying. They don't get security interests. So we can encroach closer and closer to their border. They don't get a say in this. And when Russia complains and say, hey, we need a new security architecture of Europe, they're like, nobody's listening. Nobody's listening. And what happens? Russia has to effectively invade Ukraine in order to take that piece at the barrel of a gun or take their respect at the barrel of a gun. Then all of a sudden Europe is like, oh my God. And they're terrified because you have a 1 million man military that has been killing and dying for 3 years and that can effectively eat Europe alive if they need to. They're not trying to, but hard power was the thing that garnered that respect and that attention. And if it wasn't for that, Ukraine would have been part of NATO, meaning they would have just expanded NATO to surround to get this kind of fait accompli. Iran is something similar in this, where Iran is like, okay, we're willing to negotiate, despite the fact that they shouldn't have to negotiate anything. They're a sovereign country, but okay, they're willing to negotiate. And Donald Trump goes into the negotiations as if we can tell you what to do. You don't get sovereignty because we're the US and you're Iran, so we get to tell you what to do. And I remember I kept saying Iran will most likely need to skirmish, or Iran is going to have to take their respect at the barrel of a gun. And lo and behold, a sneak attack with the US backing Israel in their attacks with the goal of overthrowing the government of Iran. Iran stands strong, and in standing strong, Trump had to throw his body on Israel in order to effectively try to force a ceasefire because of the damage that Israel was taking. Now, let's be very clear. Israel will violate the ceasefire, and we will see what happens when they violate this quote-unquote ceasefire. But in both cases, they had to take their respect at the barrel of a gun. Iran has maintained its nuclear enrichment. The U.S. and apparently the IAEA no longer knows where it is. So any notion of the JCPOA is off the table. You have the Trump administration now saying, well, the objective, was to stop enrichment. And it doesn't really matter if they still have nuclear material, they can't put it on a bomb, which is what Iran wanted in the first place before any of this stuff started. I hope you get my point. Like, is peace possible without some level of violence to ensure the integrity of the person who wants that peace? Give me your thoughts on this.
Well, I think we have to just acknowledge that the reason we have wars is because we live under imperialism, monopolistic capitalism, and the rule of the world by big bankers and corporations. And the countries we go to war with tend to be countries that have broken out of that system and established their independence and built themselves up. And that's why they're being targeted. They're competitors. Iran sells oil on the international markets, and every barrel of oil they sell is a barrel somebody didn't buy from ExxonMobil or BP or Shell or Chevron. China They make their own cell phones. So they make cell phones that are way better than Apple. They make half the steel in the world, right? They're the leading producer of train technology, and they lifted themselves up out of poverty. And China's no longer an impoverished client state that you can dump our products on and dump drugs on. HSBC Bank was created to dump drugs and opium onto China. Now China is a competitor. They don't want a competitor. Russia, after the fall of the Soviet Union, was impoverished, experiencing economic looting. But then Putin fixed their economy, and he built two amazing state-controlled mega corporations, Gazprom and Rosneft. And now Russia's a competitor on the oil and gas markets. They don't want competitors. They want to dominate the world. They want the whole world to be their client. They want the world to be an impoverished captive market for Wall Street corporations and for the London bankers. And the world doesn't want that. They want to keep rising and developing. And so countries are going to break out of this system, and they're going to start building and constructing, and then they're going to be a target. And those countries are going to have to then defend themselves, and they're going to have to build up their forces. But ultimately, the road to peace is a new economic setup. We need an economic system that is not based on monopolies. We need countries to trade with each other on the basis of win-win cooperation and mutual interest. And there is a new economy rising in the world, the BRICS economy, that is more structured in that way, in that finance and banking is not central. You have state-run banks, you have industries that are directed as part of 5-year plans. These are countries that emerged out of anti-colonial revolutions, and their economies are structured in a different way, that they don't have to behave in this monopolistic way, and that they can see mutual interests. And people go back to, times in American history, we had, policies that were somewhat similar to what China's doing with the Belt and Road, or what Russia's doing with the Eurasian Economic Union. If you look at the writings of Henry Charles Carey, who was Abraham Lincoln's economic advisor, you look at what Alexander Hamilton advocated with the creation of a national bank, et cetera, that there is possibly an alternative economic model. But right now we live under imperialism, the rule of the world by banks and finance, and we live under this monopolistic stage of capitalism, and countries around the world have broken out of it. And there's going to be a clash between those two systems. And I think that's how we can understand why war is almost not a choice. It's the only way this system that we live under can be maintained. But the reality is it's bad for America. It's bad for American working families. We're getting poorer as a country. Our country is becoming less stable. And the only future we're going to have is a new economic model. We need to join with the new alternative economy rather than attacking it. And that's what the Center for Political Innovation, my organization, advocates. And that's the road to peace. And we're in the middle of a war crisis. I am absolutely disgusted with how Trump has conducted himself. It would be great if this ceasefire were to hold, but it's not going to hold. Israel's violated it already, from what we understand, and Iran has to protect itself. And Iran is at this point, being celebrated all over the world for the fact that they're retaliating against Israel and imposing consequences on Israel for their cowardly strikes that murdered scientists, murdered top generals, killed whole families, destroyed whole entire apartment buildings. Iran is retaliating, and Israel is enduring retaliation at this point on a scale that they may not have expected. I don't think Israel expected that Iran could do what Iran is doing. So this is not a good situation. I think Russia's got an important role, perhaps, in de-escalating things. But it looks like now Donald Trump is trying to scale this down. But buddy, you started this. You enabled Netanyahu to attack Iran. You then attacked Iran yourself. And then you want to be able to be the hero and just say game over. I'm not. The world isn't buying it, and I mean, Trump has done an awful thing, and he's in an awful spot, I must say. So I hope that, cooler heads will prevail, and I hope that Russia and China can step in and find some kind of resolution where missiles stop flying sometime soon, because we don't want this to expand. This is very, very dangerous.
But as you pointed out, it has to expand, right? I mean, if indeed you're right, and that there's a clash in regards to, let's say, a percentage of the globe that wants to remain hegemonic. They want to control resources, control oil, minerals, materials, etc. And they look at all of these countries that are trying to create a new economic model as a threat to that hegemonic control. Isn't by definition of wanting to maintain hegemonic control calls for conflict, meaning it drives conflict. I want your resources. Okay, well, I don't want you to have my resources. Okay, well, now we're at odds with one another. I want you to be non-sovereign. Well, I don't want you to take my sovereignty. Okay, well, now we're at odds. Like, it's a consistent and perpetual almost drive for conflict. There's no way out of that box. So even if they come to some, okay, well, we're going to take a breather now, Iran is just a front in a larger war, just like Russia is a front in a larger war, just like China with Taiwan is going to be a front in a larger war, or the Sahel states. Or correct me if I'm wrong. Give me your take on it.
Well, no, you're not wrong. And this is an ongoing struggle. I mean, this is imperialism versus the countries around the world that have broken out of it. And ultimately, the solution is for the Western countries to break out of it as well. And that we need to form an anti-monopoly coalition. The people in the United States, working people, small business owners, even some of the rich who don't want this kind of monopolistic system, this degrowth system that's making us all poorer. We need to get together and break our country out of imperialism also. I have seen that Nicolas Maduro, the leader of Venezuela, has issued a call for a global peace conference, an urgent call for an international gathering to de-escalate tensions. I think that's very important. I hope the international community pays attention to what Nicolas Maduro is saying. But yeah, I'm absolutely disgusted with the Trump administration and how they're acting. And we have to do everything we can to prevent World War III. I mean, we can't just sit here and say it's inevitable, right? I mean, there is going to be conflict, et cetera. But, one result of that conflict could be, the end of the human race. I mean, could be, a nuclear war is something that we certainly don't want to go through. The transition to a new world, ultimately it should be as bloodless and smooth as possible. I mean, the underlying economic foundations are there, but there is a new world rising, and that we have a responsibility as human beings, not just to sit back and say, well, that's nothing I can do about it. We have a responsibility to take action. And that's scary to people, right? It's easy to just sit back and say it's hopeless because then there's no responsibility. But I believe as human beings, we do have the ability to impact world events, to change the conversation. And we should do as much as we possibly can to nudge things in the right direction. And that's why I'm urging people to be politically active. That's why I'm building the Center for Political Innovation. I think we have the ability to nudge things in a better direction. Obviously, there are forces that are far bigger than any of us at play here. I tell people it's kind of like, imagine there's a giant boulder that's about to roll down the mountain. Well, you can't stop the boulder from rolling down the mountain. You didn't start the boulder. It's gravity. It's rolling on its own. But we can nudge it in one direction or nudge it in another direction. And that's an important responsibility that we have. And we can nudge the boulder in one direction or another. We can try to have an impact on the bigger forces that are in motion.
I accept that. And I do get your point. Being cynical and saying there's nothing you can do about it, the world's going to end, seems the worst position to take, if that makes sense. Yeah. And you're right. Gravity can make a difference. If you have an asteroid coming to hit Earth, you can take a weight and kind of gravitate it around it in order to pull it 1 or 2 degrees. 1 or 2 degrees makes a big difference if you're talking about something on galactic scales. So I accept it. You felt that way about Trump, though, too, that Trump could be nudged. Do you still think he could be nudged?
Well, I have no regrets about boosting the MAGA.
Just to be clear, I'm not saying you should have regrets. That is not the way I'm going with that. And that's not what I'm trying to get across. Yeah.
But I think strategically boosting the peace aspect of Trump's message during the campaign made a lot of sense. And even now, and boosting the peace aspect of the MAGA movement is strategic. Look, Marjorie Taylor Greene is way more anti-war than anybody else in Congress. Yes. I mean, Thomas Massey is right there with her. And I will say AOC and Bernie have been pretty late to the party. I mean, now they're starting to say they're anti-war, but it was almost like the war had practically started before they said anything, and that your average Trumper doesn't agree with what Trump's doing here. And Marjorie Taylor Greene, she speaks up very strongly against this and represents kind of the voice of the MAGA movement, of the rank and file of the MAGA movement that understands that America first doesn't mean Israel first. Right. Engaging with those people, boosting the anti-war message that those people have to say, I think it was the right thing to do. And that it's really disappointing I will say, I did the math recently. I made a tweet. I did the math, and I'll pull it up so I get the numbers right. I don't want to get the numbers wrong here. But I was adding up the different populations in the United States, the different numbers of people in the United States. There are 206 million Christians in America. There are 29 million self-identified libertarians in America, and there are 38 million registered Republicans in America. Now, imagine how big the anti-war protest movement would be if it was not run by the Answer Coalition and the Party for Socialism and Liberation. Brian Becker controls the anti-war movement. He reserves the permits, and only woke people are allowed to participate, And because of that, the anti-war movement is very small because most woke people are pro-war. And in fact, the way they sell wars, the way NATO sells itself, the way hostility to Russia is pushed is in the name of woke politics. Iran is demonized on the basis of LGBT, on the basis of women. Russia is demonized. They've turned Ukraine into a rainbow flag, anarchist liberation cause against Putin and all of that. But the anti-war movement is dominated by woke, forces that are seeking to basically function as AOC's election campaign committee, even though AOC is not really anti-war. And because of that, it's really awful. Angela McCurdle is a great hero. She's speaking at our upcoming conference, and she organized the Rage Against the War Machine rally that had left voices like Chris Hedges, like Dennis Kucinich, but also had conservative voices and others. And, the way the Answer Coalition and their forces responded to the Rage Against the War Machine rally, it was like utter terror. Because that's the potential for a real anti-war movement. The majority of woke people are pro-war, and the majority of the American people are not woke, and the majority of people in the United States are anti-war. We need a real anti-war movement, not these kind of woke rallies that are run by Brian Becker and the PSL Answer Coalition. Right? They play a very, very negative role in basically, keeping the anti-war movement as a wing of the Democratic Party's Stop Trump hysteria. And it's a big problem. And, I hate to get on here and talk about this. Somebody might say, Caleb, of all the things to talk about right now, we're on the brink of World War III, and you want to talk shit about some leftist group. Well, I'm talking shit about some leftist group because they're stopping a big anti-war movement. There should be millions of people in the streets right now opposing this war, and they're not, because the anti-war movement has been hijacked. It's a really big problem. It's a really, really big problem. I look back to World War I. World War I wouldn't have happened if it hadn't been for socialist groups that ran the trade unions that marched workers off to World War I. We're in that kind of situation right now. We could have millions of people in the streets, except anti-war politics is dominated by people who are determined to make sure that isn't happening because they'd rather argue about pronouns. All right. I mean, the Party for Socialism and Liberation and Brian Becker are a serious problem. They are the roadblock to a real anti-war movement happening, and we need to just call them out. We just need to call them out for what they are.
I want to diverge slightly because I want to nail down that I wasn't criticizing you for taking that position. It was not a criticism. You're right. It doesn't. Chris Hedges has this line where he says, you do good because it's good. Like, you hope that the good leads to something. It's not that you know it as a flat fact, but you do it because that's the only thing to do. I wasn't criticizing you for it. I think I was thinking more in line of, it's easy to kind of look at this stuff and think to yourself, okay, these people are lunatics. And, screaming at them doesn't change it. But that's not entirely true. I think you're right. I think the majority of the American public will be against war if it's explained to them in the context of why it is a bad thing. That is not the way it is explained to them. And you would get the American public who would look at this issue with Iran right now. And instead of the argument being, well, why are we telling a sovereign state what to do? Israel has nukes, so we're going to invade Israel. They would argue it in the sense of, well, does Iran have nukes? And if they do, then it's okay. Meaning the entire framing of it is off.
Completely.
And that's the thing of media. That's the thing of the political branch. That's the thing of the way Americans think. That is an inhibition to any anti-war movement if you can't even frame it in a way that makes sense. I hope that makes sense, right? It's not
Yeah,
just
no, I know what you're saying. And it's the way the mainstream media is talking about it is ridiculous. The idea that Iran has a nuclear weapon or is trying to get a nuclear weapon, they're so far from that. It's like laughable, right? They've signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So from the get-go, every nuclear site in Iran is monitored 24 hours a day by the International Atomic Energy Agency. They have not once been found in violation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Then in 2015, they gave up almost all of their peaceful nuclear energy program. They got rid of almost all of it in exchange for the USA admitting in writing that, yes, they technically do have the right to peaceful nuclear energy. So they got rid of something that they had the right to do, which is peaceful nuclear energy. And then in response to that, the USA pulled out of the deal and didn't fulfill the deal and murdered their top general, put more sanctions on the country, didn't fulfill their end of the bargain. So then Iran started, maybe enriching some more uranium. And that's the situation that we're in. I will say that, there is an element, and we're in a new landscape in terms of media. I was just at an amazing conference in Russia. That's why I haven't been online as much. I was at the Global Digital Forum where we talked about these kind of things because we're in kind of a new sphere here. But Donald Trump, when he got up there and he said, I got him, I destroyed, no, you didn't. Right. The New York Times has followed up and seen this, but Iranian media said the same thing. I heard about the strikes. We all heard about the strikes, not from Iranian media, but from Trump, because the strikes had so little impact. Iran didn't even notice them, right, until Trump announced them. He damaged the entry tunnel to this nuclear facility. 3 days before the strike, they got all the nuclear material out of there. Right. Yes. And then Trump blew up the entrance tunnel. Nothing happened. Right. But yet Trump, he's on there. I got him. It was magnificent. Oh, no military in the world could do what we just did. It was the most epic strike ever. And it's this is not reality. He's saying things that are not true, but his supporters believe it. And I noticed mainstream media was kind of echoing it too. Like MSNBC, they're saying, oh, Trump did a devastating blow against Iran's nuclear. No, you didn't. You did absolutely nothing. This was a completely fake symbolic strike that had absolutely no impact on the Iranian facilities whatsoever. So much so that Iranian media didn't even announce it at the time. You'd think if there was a big epic strike in the country, they'd warn people or something. We heard about it from Trump. Trump had to announce to the world that he did it because nobody noticed. It was so ridiculous. But yet Trump can talk about it in one way and he can just bluff. And it's the same with this nuclear issue. You would think Iran's, going to get a nuclear weapon tomorrow if you listen to mainstream media, and it just doesn't match reality. So it's very disturbing how people can just kind of bluff. Polls are showing the American people don't want further involvement
against
in this conflict,
right?
Maybe they don't understand the nuclear issue the way we just laid it out or whatever, but the American people just don't want further involvement. Hardcore Israel supporters do. A certain layer of Trump MAGA people do. Christian evangelicals that are taking their lead from Mike Huckabee, they do. But the bulk of the American people don't support this. The bulk of Congress does, which is a gap that is horrifying. It's so blatant. You have the majority of Democrats, the majority of Republicans don't want us to get involved, but yet you have the bulk of elected Republicans in Congress, elected Democrats in Congress saying, oh yeah, we got to do whatever Israel wants. It's so obvious the stranglehold that Israel has on our politics and how Israel is just a sacred cow that you're not allowed to criticize. And, we're in this age where people don't like political correctness, right? That's Trump's whole thing is he's not politically correct. That is the biggest form of political correctness we've got. The fact that there's a law in a number of states that if you are going to be an elected official, you cannot boycott Israel. You have to sign that you will not boycott Israel. Yeah. It is, and it's not that you won't, that you won't, do something bad to Israel. It's that you will not boycott. A boycott is just not doing business. So you're basically signing, I must buy Israeli products. How is that the free market? How is that? It's ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. Israel has way too much power. Everybody knows it. They have a stranglehold on our politics, and something's going to be done about this. And this has been the reality for a long time in American politics, but now in the age of social media and in the age of kind of an awakening in political discourse, because there's access to podcasts like this where people can hear things, it's not going to stand. This has been a long time. I remember the first election that I was kind of paying very close attention to. I was a teenager. Was the 2004 election between George W. Bush and John Kerry. And you'll
Yes.
remember there were two big movies that came out that summer during the election. One was Fahrenheit 9/11, made by
Yep.
Michael Moore. That was the anti-Bush film. Well, Michael Moore dedicated one of his books to Rachel Corrie, the peace activist who was run over by a bulldozer by the Israelis. And Michael Moore has been critical in the past. He's pretty silent now, but he's been quite critical in the past. At the time that movie came out, he was quite critical of Israel. What was the other movie that came out that summer? Passion of the Christ by Mel Gibson. And
That's
Mel,
right.
Mel Gibson was also no fan of Israel. Pat Buchanan said the 2004 election was Michael Moore versus Mel Gibson. Well, both of those guys don't like Israel, and the bulk of Bush supporters, rank and file American Midwestern Christians who voted for Bush, don't like Israel, and the bulk of left-wing activists and urban folks and college professors and people that didn't like Bush and all, both of them didn't like Israel. And beneath the surface, on the far left and the far right, everybody doesn't like Israel, but yet the political establishment in America is 100%, Israeli bought and owned. And it's been like that for a long time. It's the emperor has no clothes. Israel is just something that it's this ring that you have to kiss to get any place in American politics. And it's degrading. And every so often I've noticed there are little like things from the left and the right where it's almost like the political establishment knows how humiliated and how under the control of Israel it is. And so they send out a little FU. I remember when Obama was leaving office, you remember, like just as Obama was leaving office, there was a UN resolution criticizing Israel, and the USA refused to veto it. And then John Kerry gave a speech at the State Department where he said, Israel can remain Jewish or democratic. It can't be both. And that was clearly just a line that he wrote just to be an FU. And Holocaust Remembrance Day, Donald Trump and his administration, they listed every group that died in the Holocaust except for the Jews. That was kind of a little like, FU, right? And every so often there'll be something where it's like the people in the political establishment, like, yeah, you guys have the power. Yeah, you guys have the ability to, veto our politicians and all of that. We know it and we don't like it, right? I believe as Bill Clinton was leaving office, he got pretty sick of Netanyahu and made some comments, and that was quite interesting. And there were similar things. Even the Bush administration, there were little moments where it was almost like they were like, okay, we don't like this. I mean, there's a growing resentment about the kind of the stranglehold on Israeli politics. It's not like we love Israel and we're just all on board. There are certain people that are just completely under Israel's control. And Nikki Haley is one of those individuals. For example, but there's a lot of politicians that go along with it, and they follow the script. They follow the red lines that they have to follow, but they're really not happy about it. And I feel like there's going to be a reckoning down the road. And I see the great journalism of Gray Zone, what they've done, exposing how this works, what's been written by Whitney Webb, her great work on the Epstein case and all of that. And I feel like there's going to be a moment where everyone just tells Israel to go to hell. And everyone just says, we're tired of it. All right. Israel, we're done. All right. It's over. And I don't know how that's going to happen. And honestly, that could go in a very dangerous direction. One thing, I wrote a book years ago that was harshly critical of Israel. I went to Iran, I spoke at a conference, and I got the idea. I wrote a book criticizing Israel. And honestly, I made some mistakes in that book. And it used to be the first thing that people would bring up is, well, he wrote this anti-Semitic book. He wrote, and now I've noticed in the last 2-3 years, no one ever brings that up. People bash me for all kinds of different reasons, this or that. I'm all kinds of awful things. No one ever calls me an anti-Semite anymore. Why? Because of the fact that everyone who disagrees with Israel is being called an anti-Semite, and people just roll their eyes now. And I've seen, I guess I don't want to say anything that could get anybody else in trouble, but I've seen things in the alternative media sphere that you didn't used to see. There used to be certain things that you said in the alternative media sphere that if you said them, it was one thing to be critical of Israel, but if you pushed certain buttons or said certain things, you were done. You were done. Not anymore. No, now basically, yes, you have an establishment that says you have to agree with Israel. Israel has a right to exist. You cannot criticize Israel. But outside of that, there's criticism of Israel like I've never seen before. And people just kind of roll their eyes. And if you point your finger at somebody and say, oh, you're anti-Semitic for criticizing Israel, people go, oh, yeah, right. Yeah, we're all anti-Semites. Yeah. And the discourse is changing. I mean, we're heading for kind of a big shift in the conversation. Let me just put it that way.
Do you think part of that is because they've just murdered 100,000 people or 200,000 people? I mean, the Harvard study is saying 400,000, but even if I cut the number in half, it's a genocide. They've slaughtered people en masse before our eyes, day in and day out, and in some of the most horrific ways, including starvation, shooting people when they go to the food dispensaries that they themselves have set up. Like, this stuff is grotesque.
Yeah.
And the rest of the world looks at this with horror. I agree with you. There's a gap in the political space versus what the public thinks about this. And so, the public gets more brutal in the way that it talks about it because of how brutal the Israelis gets. For fuck's sake, I would wager to you that the overwhelming majority of the world looks at what Iran did and applauds Iran doing it.
Yeah.
And I would tell you, I've shown videos drinking coffee of Israel's getting bombed, and the audience is like, more. Like, meaning they've gotten to the point where, because of their brutality, that the public wants a reckoning for that brutality, and they don't see that reckoning happening. And Iran being the only place that's giving that reckoning, they applaud it. I guess my thing is, but that hasn't translated into legalistic power. That hasn't translated into sanctions. That has meaning what the public wants and what the public sees and the way the public feels is not being expressed in any political sense at all. In fact, it's being suppressed in a political sense. Do you see that changing? Is there a consequence for having this much ire against you from the rest of the world? Because I haven't seen it yet.
Well, first of all, I just want to say that, I'm not going to be applauding when bombs are falling on Israel. As much as I understand, Iran is responding completely legitimately as any other country would. And maybe there was a time in my life where I would have been like that. But I'm at the point where I really urge people to not ever celebrate violence against another person, to not ever celebrate that kind of thing. And that, I understand that this is happening because Israel has done such horrendous things and faced no accountability around it internationally. And there's a lot of anger and resentment. And I don't feel a need to silence somebody, especially somebody from the Muslim world who feels that way. But at the same time, I would urge people, especially people that are critical of Israel, to not do things that, the only way we're going to have peace, you can't dehumanize your enemy. You have to recognize your enemy is a human to some degree or other. And I've done a lot of reflection in the last few years. And while I recognize Iran is responding legitimately, I don't celebrate what's happening to Israel right now. Just like I wouldn't celebrate, especially not civilians, I wouldn't celebrate attacks on anybody. But that said, I also want to point out that part of the reason we're in such a big crisis, and part of the reason Donald Trump has acted in ways that are erratic, is the response to Israel and everything that's happened since October 7th is to the detriment of the American political establishment. All right, let's point this out. I've made this point before, and it must be made. Harvard and Yale and the Ivy League schools, Columbia, that's where a lot of these protests were happening, especially Columbia was like a center of it. Those places serve a soft power purpose for the United States. Rich people from all over the world and high achieving students from India and Pakistan and the African continent and South America, they all go there and they have an amazing experience, and they see that America is a happy, happy, fun land where we just do everything great and that we're tolerant and open-minded, and they make business connections, and they go back to their country, and that's where they kind of become groomed to be allies and supporters of U.S. imperialism around the world. That's the purpose those schools serve, is they serve a soft power purpose. And Brzezinski, in his book, The Grand Chessboard, he opens the book by talking about how important the Ivy League schools are for international relations, right? They serve that purpose. And Muslims are a really, really big factor in the world. There's many, many Muslims. There's many, many Muslim countries. So for the purpose of maintaining U.S. empire, you need those Muslim students to come to Harvard, to come to Columbia, and see that while America supports Israel, look, there's big protests and demonstrations. Muslim Americans are free to speak out. You need that for propaganda. You need that. And yet those schools are so reliant on Zionist donors that they have to drag those students out. They have to say from the river to the sea is anti-Semitic, and they can't serve that purpose. Look, Mahmoud Khalil, I'm glad he's free. No one should be deported for their political views. But he's not just some guy who happened to oppose Israel and went to Colombia. Mahmoud Khalil is a U.S. Intelligence asset, right? I mean, British intelligence mainly. I mean, he was heavily involved in trying to overthrow the Syrian government. He was, I mean, and he's an intelligence asset. He's somebody involved in the American deep state who, on the one hand, is very anti-Israel. On the other hand, agrees with U.S. foreign policy on Syria, on Iran, on some other countries, and was operating as a functionary. And probably, there are people in the deep state that's, that wanted Mahmoud Khalil and the Columbia students to go out there and organize those protests so the Muslim students could see that America has room for them and all of that. Well, it looks like America doesn't have room for them, right? I mean, Zionism is so powerful that even though that would be functional and to the benefit of U.S. imperialism to have Muslim people see that America is a tolerant, happy fun land, I guess we're not able to do that. The Muslim Brotherhood, right, is a really, really big ally. Obama could not have pulled off the Arab Spring the way he did without the Muslim Brotherhood.
That's so
right?
true.
Turkey
Especially in Egypt.
and Qatar and Al Jazeera, they were the propaganda outlet. When people were out in the streets protesting, overthrow Bashar Assad, overthrow Gaddafi, and all of that. And they're anti-Israel. The Muslim Brotherhood, they're Muslims. They're anti-Israel. They're what you call westernized Muslims. They believe in capitalism. They believe in the free market. But they are Muslims. They're very deeply religious Muslims, and they oppose Israel. And the Muslim Brotherhood is something that the United States has used to carry out its foreign policy goals all throughout that region. It was first boosted by the United States against Abdel Nasser in Egypt, and that's when it really expanded in the 1950s. All over the Middle East. And the Muslim Brotherhood is really essential in the USA carrying out its goals in the Middle East. And the Muslim Brotherhood's anti-Israel, and the Muslim Brotherhood has, been so dissed. And, Trump will pander to Israel and say he wants to put the Muslim Brotherhood on the foreign terrorist list. And the Muslim Brotherhood is so angry at the United States. They make anti-American, films and stuff. I mean, it's like Obama, so key in what Obama did in his regime change operations in the Middle East was the Muslim Brotherhood. And now the Muslim Brotherhood and the USA are at complete odds. So, I mean, this is, the U.S. establishment doesn't quite know what it's doing. Let me also add that a big part of what Obama was trying to do was polarize the Muslim world, right? And that continued under Trump's first term. They were going to build an Arab NATO against Iran, right? Iran is Shia, and the Arab countries are largely Sunni. I mean, there's a lot of Shia throughout, but Iran is a Shia government. Saudi Arabia is a Sunni Wahhabi government. You have the Muslim Brotherhood elsewhere. And the idea was to polarize Sunnis against Shias and, unify, kind of build an Arab NATO. And Trump, that's how he got the Abraham Accords, right? He got a couple Muslim countries to recognize Israel because Iran was just such a threat. They had to recognize Israel or whatever. That's all gone to hell. That's all ancient history. The whole Muslim world is cheering for Iran. Saudi Arabia is defending Iran's right to strike back against Israel, and that's all gone. The whole strategy of dividing Sunnis against Shias, building an Arab NATO against Iran, dividing the Muslim world and building some kind of anti-Iran coalition with Sunni Muslims, etc. That's just not happening anymore because what Israel is doing is so atrocious, and that no Muslim can support it. And then if you're opposed to what Israel's doing, you have to look at the Houthis that are Shia, right? You have to look at them as great heroes for the picket line they set up in the Red Sea. You have to look at Hezbollah in Lebanon. They're Shia. They're aligned with Iran. You have to look at them as great heroes for opposing Israel. You have to look at Iran that's now retaliating against Israel in a way that no other country ever has before. You have to look at them as great heroes. And so isolating the Shia axis of resistance, that's what they call themselves, the axis of resistance, right? I think it was around the time Bush had the axis of evil. I think Nasrallah in Lebanon, he started saying, well, we're not the axis of evil, we're the axis of resistance. That was the term they started using. The axis of resistance is loved almost universally by Muslims. And if you don't love the axis of resistance, something's wrong with you because they're the ones actually fighting Israel. So yeah, Israel is at this point, I mean, it's almost like the Achilles heel. I mean, the U.S. military and the U.S. political establishment is so beholden to Israel. It's doing things that are setting back its strategy. Netanyahu, many people have pointed out, he's similar to the new right in Europe, right? Nigel Farage, Marine Le Pen, Trump in the United States, and that Netanyahu is not a team player for this global imperialist system. He just cares about Israel and its interests. And his base of support tends to be like settlers, right? People who moved to Israel from Eastern Europe and all of that. And the reason that there are a lot of like George Soros funded groups protesting against Netanyahu, right? That want to bring back the hostages, they call it, and all of that, is because they can see that Netanyahu does not care about the long-term interest of globalism and the long-term, human rights agenda of the World Economic Forum. He just wants to get in as many punches and blows for Israel as possible. And he's tied in with the Israeli military and with the right-wing settlers. And that he's acting in the interest of his particular group of military people and settlers, and not in the overall interest of the strategy of the system that Israel serves. And he's just like Zelensky in the sense that if there's ever peace, he's done, right? If there's ever peace in Ukraine, Zelensky's out of office. If there's ever peace, if this war stops since October 7th, then Benjamin Netanyahu is done. He's out of politics, right? The Israeli people don't even want him anymore. So, we have a situation where it's almost like in order to save his career, he's keeping this going, and the imperialists almost don't want him, but yet he has this ability. He has certain grips on them, right? He's got certain holds on them that they can't even resist. It's a wild situation. There's some of the podcasts that are more pessimistic. They have this kind of conspiracy narrative where everything's part of the grand plan. No, everything's not part of the grand plan. If there was a grand plan, things would be operating a lot more smoothly. There's a lot of things that are out of control and people don't know what they're doing. And that creates openings for guys like you and me that do understand we need a new world. We need development. We need a system of win-win cooperation. That creates an opportunity for us to build and construct and start laying the foundations of the movement that we need.
Just be clear, those things are mutually exclusive. Like, I remember I was having this conversation with Brian Belletti, and as I would point out to him, I was like, look, just because somebody writes something down doesn't mean it works. And you can have all the grand ideas that you want. Let's have negotiations. Let's pretend as if we're doing this. Let's attack, in this case. And you are ill prepared for the fact that Iran could defend itself. Okay, well, that's not part of a grand plan, right? Or if you are going after Russia and you are ill prepared for the level of capability that Russia can muster, okay, again, that's not part of a plan. That's you failing miserably at what you're effectively doing. Like, you can write stuff down and you can have a plan. Doesn't mean it works. And so I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I still think I agree with you that there are spaces for people to try to push. Like, who knows what happens if there's a full-blown war and you get tens of thousands of Americans in body bags? What happens in the United States when the U.S. acknowledges, A, we didn't agree to the war, B, you have all of these people dying in this war, and C, it is your fault that those people are dying? Okay, how do you sustain that as a war? And is that part of a grand plan, if that makes sense? I guess I'm saying both things can be true. You can have the situation of people coming up with these war plans. Project of a New American Century, right? Bush gets in. We're going to shape the Middle East using American power. It takes 20 years, but they've done it. It was part of a plan. You've had things that were out of control. You've had hiccups. You've had things that didn't necessarily happen on schedule, and yet inexorably it moved in a particular direction. I'm trying to agree with you, and I guess I'm doing both simultaneously.
Well, I got to tell you, the amount of impact that our organization, the Center for Political Innovation, has had, despite the fact we're quite a small organization, is quite surprising to me. You'll notice when Donald Trump, had the USS Truman, I believe was the name of the battleship that was in the Red Sea, and they were carrying out their strikes in Yemen, and it looked like there were going to start being U.S. sailors coming home in body bags. You'll notice that J.D. Vance, the Vice President of the United States, he is doing interviews and he's like, all these people are saying Yemen is the new Vietnam. It's not the new Vietnam. Yemen is not the new Vietnam. And making a big show. Yemen is not the new Vietnam, right? I thought, that's odd. Who's saying that? And then I thought of, oh, wow, there's thousands of books being distributed all over the country that make that exact analogy, that Yemen is the new Vietnam, right? To talk about this, right?
Yeah, for sure.
And in fact, I 4 or 5 years ago, there was a podcast that I was invited on, like a forum with different British politicians from the Workers' Party and from other things, where I actually, the speech I gave was Yemen is the Vietnam of our time.
Interesting.
And I'm just like, okay, that's interesting that he's coming out there. And then you'll notice then when it became clear that U.S. soldiers and sailors were going to be coming home in body bags, that's when, they reached this agreement with the Houthis. They won't attack U.S. ships. Israel's fair game or whatever. And that was interesting. And you'll also notice that in this particular moment, right, with Qatar, the U.S. base in Qatar, that Iran gave warning to the United States that they were going to blow up the base, and no U.S. soldiers died, and Trump thanked them for it. And it was, it was almost like, it's weird. You would think that, probably the way Trump wants to frame it is, oh, if anyone kills one of ours, it's on. It's not like that at all. If we start seeing American soldiers and sailors coming home in body bags, the American public will rise against this war as they've never seen.
Right there. And I think that's true.
Yeah.
That's what I mean. That's not part of the script. Like, that's not what they wrote down, right?
Yeah, and let's be real, okay? U.S. soldiers did die in the Red Sea, and the U.S. media covered it up. And I've never seen anything like it. There were reports like, U.S. soldiers went missing in the Red Sea. And it's like, no, they didn't go missing. There were Houthi strikes on U.S. ships, and that instead of playing it up like, oh, those Houthis killed some good American boys, the U.S. media was like, oh, there were some accidents. There's a couple of people missing. Let's not talk about it. And they've been changing they moved the conversation away from that as possible, right? And that you will not know. You would not know if you listen to American media, but it's pretty apparent if you read between the lines that at least 2 or 3, maybe 5 or 6 U.S. soldiers died at the hands of the Houthis. But they don't want anyone to know that, because rather than rallying to support military, strikes on the Houthis, that will lead to the American people being more outraged and wanting it to end. And that soldiers are more anti-war than the general public is. That's the wild story, right? During the Vietnam War, there was a huge effort to win over the soldiers to be anti-war. Now it's the soldiers that are winning over the rest of the population. Ron Paul and Thomas Massey, people like that, have more support in the military than anywhere else, because they're going, what are these wars about? And they're the ones that have to fight it. And there's more anti-war sentiment in the rank and file, at least, of the military than there are even among the general public. So we're in a very, very odd situation as a country. And we're going to have to see how this develops. But I struggle to always be optimistic and to try and think, how can we intervene? How can we see something happening, and how can we intervene? And I'm very proud that we tried to boost the pro-peace aspects of Trump's message. And who knows what could happen down the road, but we're just going to keep doing what we're doing. But ultimately, it's up to average Americans. The bulk of the American people need to get into motion. We need a real mass peace movement in this country. That's what I'm committed to building, a movement fighting for working families. We need a government of action that fights for working families. Bring those troops home from around the world and have them rebuild Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Texas, pave some new roads, build some high-speed railway, get some scientists going on fusion energy. Wouldn't it be great if we had a social media app that made young people more physically fit and more confident and proud of who they are, instead of a social media app that does the opposite? Social media does the opposite to young people. Wouldn't it be great if we had a social media app that really built people up and helped them be better, stronger people? I think that's what we need to start figuring out. And we need a government that'll do that. So I look to Burkina Faso and this great African leader, Ibrahim Traore, what he's doing, enabling all kinds of Africans to become farmers, and the education projects that he's doing. And, there is a new world. America's got to join that new world, and that's the future.
Caleb, from your mouth to God's ears. And again, I just want to be very clear. Wasn't criticizing you for the peace thing. It was necessary. I mean, look, and we can end it on this. I was not an ideologue on Trump one way or the other. I didn't have Trump derangement. I thought, okay, see what he does. He's saying he's a man of peace. He's going to be holding a dove. See if that's the case. Because you never know. Trump, he could really get in and say, I'm sick of this war. That's Joe Biden's war. I am ending this in Gaza. He could have done those things. He had the power to do those things. He just didn't do those things. But there's no way to know that as a flat fact when you were looking at it from a distance. And your argument is correct. Push him. Maybe he does. There's no wrong in that. That's a positive thing. Maybe he does accept, he wants praise, he wants adulation. And if you press him in this way, he may move in this direction. I mean, even the language that they're talking now, they still talk this language of, they feel the need to talk in this language that Donald Trump is a man of peace and all of this other stuff. So you're not wrong. I wasn't criticizing you for it.
Yeah.
It's just, sometimes it's hard to see that vision.
Yeah.
If it makes sense.
Yeah. No, it's hard. Everything. There's so much negativity coming at us 24 hours a day. And it's like a constant battle to just not give into that negativity and focus on what good can we do with the resources that we have, with the relationships and the situations we have. How can we do good? That's something that we all have to wake up every day and ask ourselves. And it's hard to do in a world with so much negativity everywhere and so much, alienation, people, isolated from each other, people, just kind of, on their own and atomized. It's a very difficult world, but we just have to do the best we can. And I think if we continue to do that, we can have an impact. That is my message.
Caleb, Maupin, you are a better person than me. I will tell you that right off the bat.
I don't know about that. I don't know you well enough, but I don't think it's a contest. I think we all just do the best we can. We have different roles to play. So, I always think of the story of Gus Hall, the old leader of the Communist Party, and that in the 80s, he was running for president and a guy walked up to him crying. And he said, Gus, I couldn't do it back in the 50s, after they killed the Rosenbergs and the FBI was coming to my house and all that. I burned my party card. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Gus Hall said, no, comrade. He said, you did what you could do and I did what I can do. And we all have a different role to play in the struggle. And I think about that story. It's not like anyone's better than anybody else. We all are in unique circumstances. We have the ability to contribute in our own way. And we just have to wrangle with ourselves and figure out how we can contribute. That's the way I look at these things.
Caleb Maupin, speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, author. Caleb, you can talk about anything. And I think I've told you that before. I've sat there and watched you give speeches and give commentary on some of any and everything. And your breadth of knowledge is always impressive. Thank you for this. And just to be clear, Center for Political Innovation. Definitely check them out. You say you guys have a meeting coming up.
July 12th, we have a huge event in Chicago. It's going to be big. It's at the Midwest Conference Center. You can read about it on our website, cpiusa.org. Working Families First at the Midwest Conference Center in Mid-Lake, Illinois, which is really close to the O'Hare Airport. We're packing them in. We got some big speakers and big guests, music. There's going to be like a Russian dance team that's performing. It's going to be wild. So, yeah.
Are you going to cover it in video?
Oh, yeah. We'll have loads of video afterwards. So, yeah. It's going to be good.
Afterwards. Oh, yeah. I was going to ask if you wanted to cover it live.
No, it won't be live, but there'll be video afterwards for sure. Yeah.
Fair enough. Thank you, my man. You be safe, okay?
Yep. No problem.
All right. Great